How's it going, guys? Big, small cast here. Small, big, really small, whatever it is. Just a solo podcast today, just with Eden today. I kind of wanted to dedicate this podcast to talking about kind of my current thoughts, things that are going on in my mind right now. And I kind of maybe wanted to double back on episode 2, how to improve yourself, and maybe reiterate some of the ideas that I was mentioning in that podcast. I think I should reinstate them a little bit in this podcast as maybe a little bit more, well, basically just kind of explain myself a little bit more so it kind of makes more sense. Um, but we'll see how it goes and we'll just kind of let things flow. I'm still in the process of kind of learning how to really collect my thoughts together and make them into a concise argument and something that I feel like I can express and that kind of gets across. It's definitely a skill you have to develop because, I mean, anybody can have thoughts, but organizing them with words and speaking with confidence and fluently and not stuttering and having a nice vocabulary and pronunciation, all these little things make the information more easy to digest. And it's been a process. And I've never really been, well, I'm the talk. Everybody, has different aspects of themselves that flourish in certain situations. I've always been quite talkative in certain situations with my friends when a topic gets interesting or when, you know, I'm put on the spot and I feel like I need to say something. Sometimes, on this podcast, I can find myself free flowing my words a little bit and my thoughts kind of come out organically and uh, feels good to have that happen when it does, but definitely nowhere on the levels that I want it because I think one of the goals in my life is to try and, well, I'm not really sure how to describe it, but I definitely want to be able to get my ideas across to other people and have them be able to understand. And then from that, be able to reciprocate how they feel about it. And then maybe, we can both grow from that. It's a useful tool to have because I mean that's how you can build connections with people. That's how you can get up in life, impress people. It's a useful skill to have, and it's a good thing. But anyways, I digress. The first thing I really wanted to reiterate about the last episode or small big podcast episode 2, how to improve yourself, is that in that episode I mentioned an example of the limitations between things. Before that, I had gone a little bit on a tangent about, you know, my perspective on religion and stuff, and I think maybe I might try and get back to that too. I feel like I didn't really explain myself well enough, but it's okay. Um, Regardless, so I mentioned before that what brings forth existence in an essence is the limitation between things. Only truly once things are different and we can see the differences and experience the differences between things do they truly begin to exist. I brought the example of cars on how the concept of cars itself is brought forth from the realization that there's different forms of a vehicle with four wheels that has different shapes, different sizes, different properties to it, and we had to contextualize these vehicles into a category called cars in order to categorize them. And I was trying to iterate that it's kind of the same across all things. We have different emotions because different emotions have us feeling different things or are representations of different types of actions or emotion, or there's Well, emotions are a little bit complicated because I mean, there's a lot of subjectivity to them that is a bit confusing. So maybe that's not the greatest example, but like I would just go and say you should definitely watch the Jordan Peterson Maps of Meaning excerpt video I mentioned. You could probably find on this video. Again, I'm reiterating everybody should watch that video. It's very helpful and he spent so much time thinking about that kind of stuff that he'll always be way above me in being able to explain that idea because he probably thought about it extensively and so much more than I probably ever will. But it really is the limitation between things that bring forth existence itself. Kind of reminds me of my own kind of thought experiment I created about I had written down just a little bit of writing in my phone in the notes app. I was writing down, I think I called it "It Takes Two to Tango," and by the title "It Takes Two to Tango," I was kind of trying to say that basically, in order for existence to even exist, which is a funny sentence to think about, it really takes two well, not contradictions, but the difference between two things in the beginning in an imbalance, because absolute perfect balance across the board is is basically null. It's basically nothing in itself. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I brought the example of trying to think of a blank space where there's totally an empty void. Just or try to think of absolutely nothing. Try to think of like a space that's absolute nothingness. Try to think of nothingness. Just try to just try to create that imagery in your mind and then bringing forth an object. And in this case, I think I said something like an apple or something. And I said, it's the contradiction between the space and the object that allows both of them to exist in the same place. It takes a space and something to exist in that space for them both to exist at the same time, or for one of them to exist at all. Uh, it's not the best example, but I hope it kind of gets everything across. And maybe you can do a little bit of thought experiments yourself. But that's kind of yeah, I just kind of wanted to iterate a little bit of points about that because I don't know if it was very clear what it was I was trying to say. I've kind of created this belief within myself that a lot of things exist. Well, it's not very clear why the specific things that exist do exist. For example, why is the world not more complicated, or why is it not less complicated? You know, why is it has the universe come into fruition in such a way that it is like this and not more complicated or less complicated, you know? Why has it led to this point, you know? That type of thought would either suggest some kind of like there was a purpose in it behind it, which, you know, you could argue that to the grave, and it's too difficult to prove. You have to create that purpose within yourself. You can't really apply it to some kind of truth, some kind of intrinsic truth, if that makes any sense. But so, you know, with that idea in mind about it's the differences between things that allow each of them to exist. You know, I was at a point in my life I mentioned in the previous podcast where I kind of became a little bit perfectionistic and trying to create an absolute value to my life, some kind of value that would transcend my death and would transcend everything. Something I tried to find something even, but at the end of the day it was pointless. I tried to find something that would somehow bring me the most ultimate meaning to where I could not fear my death, not fear my mistakes. I was trying to escape from myself, or try to escape from my fate in a sense. And I tried so hard to reach the absolute perfection that I tried to achieve in school and in my ideas, and I would degrade myself whenever it wasn't 100%. And of course, I there was a part of me that knew perfection didn't exist because the idea of perfection is almost is essentially the same idea as there being no limitation. because in order for, well, you could argue that something is perfectly imperfect, which is kind of paradoxical in itself, but maybe if you think of it as such, that something cannot totally be without limitation, because then it cannot exist in the world. It needs to have some kind of limitation. It needs to have some kind of distinct aspect to it that allows it to differentiate itself from other things conceptually in order for it to exist. So, at the end of the day, you could never be perfect, because in order for you to be perfect, you would have to be without limitation. And without your limitation, I mean, that sounds like an absolute meaningless existence. Why even exist? Why even strive for anything when you're perfect already? The perfect being, essentially God, completely perfect in essence. And that's not life. That's not living. And trying to strive for that is just pointless, and you won't get anywhere with it. And a part of me realized that, but I tried to strive for it anyway because I was irrational and I didn't think. And I was possessed by my ideas. They say, forgot who it is, forgot where the quote is from, but the quote is, people don't possess ideas, ideas possess people. And that's very, very true, especially nowadays, about people's beliefs and how they treat each other, and being ethnocentric, being politically one-sided, being short-sighted. All these things are kind of cause or an after effect of this. So that's just the way it is. But yeah, so limitation brings forth existence. That idea I still hold with me today, and I'm open to the idea that one day it could be changed, because if anything, I always have a healthy amount of skepticism with everything that I think about, because I'm always ready to change my mind. Sometimes I hold on to ideas a little bit too strongly, and everybody, has that potential to do that, because human beings have a strong attachment to their identity and they don't like to let it go. And there's a lot of things I hold very close to my chest that, I should not be holding so close to, but that's a difficult thing to manage, and I won't get into that. Maybe that'd be a topic for something else. Letting go might be a nice idea. But I had reached a point that I realized trying to achieve perfection was pointless. And like I mentioned in the previous podcast episode too, uh, the like the idea of heaven, or the idea of the afterlife that is brought forth from religion, I couldn't necessarily come to terms with, because I guess I kind of have a scientifically based mind, and I need empirical evidence for things for me to trust them. And I kind of almost, in an essence, am a little bit pessimistic in that sense, where I don't I won't trust something until it's proven to me that I can trust it, instead of just putting my trust in something because I want to be optimistic. That can be a perspective that can keep you safe in a lot of ways, but being optimistic can do its good in its own sense, how it can keep you positive and help you during times when you're low because you're optimistic. But I digress. So perfectionism was something I couldn't achieve, and religion really didn't offer me anything that I felt like I could attribute with me, besides the fact of, I believe all these things I'm saying about limitation and the meaning of existence. If God knew that this was the choice that had to be made in order for existence to be, and that's really, in essence, why it is things are the way they are, and why tragedy befalls everybody. It's because free will cannot exist if, well, true free will, absolute free will, actual free will cannot exist if there's someone on the sidelines pulling the strings. And it's free will that really gives us our strength and our purpose. Kind of the right to choose is really what gives us strength in life. um, and um, Sorry, just getting a little bit of a distraction there. um, so God might have had this intention behind everything, and if that's the case, then fair to him. It was necessary. It was necessary, but then there's nothing I could really do to myself to feel God, or at least at the time I didn't think I could. There was anything I could do to really do that. It was kind of pointless to believe in it in a sense. At that point, after the realization that I had that both aspects were almost synonymous, like both trains of thought were synonymous with each other to me. The fact that the world is cruel and has limits, I could, basically having it be created by God or having it be created by chance really didn't mean anything to me. Both of them resulted in the same, like the same. There was the same result either way, and so I was like, there's not really any point for me to change anything besides just remain conscientious of the fact that God is a possibility, and that the world is the way it is because of the way it is and the way I describe things I've described. So it kind of left me in a place to where nothing I didn't really gain anything in a sense besides maybe some new knowledge and some maybe more respect for people who have religious beliefs, because I think I look down upon people with religious beliefs. And you know things like the Bible are very valuable resources for people because they use the Bible. You could view it as essentially a book of metaphors on how to act about the world. Jordan Peterson goes over many of these stories in his biblical series, which you could find on Spotify and YouTube and things like that. And he breaks down the stories and their meaning and their relation to the world very, very well. I'd recommend anybody to watch those. Um, and in its essence, it's almost mythological. Like, it's like fairy tale esque. You know, the relation between the Bible and mythology is it's correlated in a sense because all these stories kind of help us help us understand how we should act about the world in the best way that helps ourselves. Um, and you know, it's very helpful to view things in that way, and that could definitely lead people down the right path, unless you're possessed by some type of ideology and you follow it without any type of thought for yourself. Um, and it's helpful to. So I gained respect for a lot of religions in essence, and I stopped looking down on them. And I kind of almost at the end of the day said, we think the same in a sense. Once we can respect each other and come to this conclusion, no matter if you're religious, believe in God, or don't believe in God, we can come to this conclusion. It's just at the end of the day, you're just attributing the origin of it all, which at the end of the day, nobody can really understand, at least not now. So, if anything, we could respect each other. So, anyways, I had reached this point where I had I had basically reached nowhere. I was still lost for meaning. I was still in a search for some kind of meaning that I felt like I could attribute some kind of divinity, some kind of ultimate purpose to my life. And no matter how hard I thought, it could not find it. It was impossible for me to find. And at the end of the day, I found nihilism. And nihilism is a dangerous place to go because it can lead so many people into depression or into pessimistic viewpoints. And it's very, very problematic. You're basically, putting yourself straight into the fucking eye of the storm, hoping to find something in the center, hoping to find your purpose in the center, and it's hell. It can be hell, and it can be extremely dangerous. And most people discourage it for this fact, and I can understand that. But I can understand nihilism from this point on in my life, and I can relate to people who believe in such a sense. And if anything, I'm almost still kind of possessed by the thoughts and the aspects of nihilism. So I'd got to this point to where regardless of whether or not there's a God or not, there's really no ultimate meaning that I can attribute to my life, because at some point I'm going to die. And regardless, I don't know what death is. And most people attribute death as returning to nothingness. And the idea of nothingness is scary, because when you try to think of the idea of nothingness, you try to think back before you were born, and you try to think of the feeling that you can have before you had any memories at all. And the idea of, it's almost as if like it's a dream, like the feeling you feel when you sleep. For a long time I was actually afraid of sleep, and even still to this day I'm actually quite afraid of sleep, because it's almost as if I'm afraid of not being conscious, not existing. I'm afraid of death and returning to an absolute nothingness. It's like a nothingness I feel, and I'm afraid to sleep. So a lot of the time I have to distract myself with videos or YouTube, because I'm actually afraid to sleep, because I'm afraid of death so significantly that I didn't want to. A little bit as time went on, I've kind of tried to find methods to mitigate this, and it's been okay with that. But regardless of the fact, it's been a process, and I was afraid of death, and still to this day I'm afraid of death. But there's some interesting aspects of death that I've kind of come to my mind recently that maybe I might get into. But so yeah, I was afraid, and I was trying to find out how to not be afraid. And there's very many like gurus and like wise men and people who talk about death as, and looking at it in a positive way. And I can kind of understand that, because a little bit now I'm starting to reach that point in my life, is using death as my friend to drive me forwards in life. And almost I kind of am now attributing the old ideas that I was mentioning before about how the limitations between things brings forth existence. You could even say that without death, without the death of anything, life could not exist. And it's only because death exists that life exists, and vice versa. So, if anything, death should be my friend, and I should be grateful for death, because without death, I would not be able to live. And living forever, I mean, there would be no concept of life if there was no death. So, if anything, I should be grateful, but there's still a part of me that's afraid of losing what I have now. And that's a rational thought to have, afraid of death. And if anything, a healthy dose of fear of death is something that can drive us to have a fulfilling life. And some people will tell you to think about death in a positive way. And there's ways you can almost kind of, through meditation and, well, I'm talking about death in terms of the non-religious belief, and the idea that you won't that we don't know that heaven exists, because I mean, nobody really necessarily knows that heaven exists. I mean, as a in the idea that it's a literal place that you will exist, not as some kind of concept or metaphor towards something else. Although, be it probably heaven is more accurately described as a metaphor or a state of being, rather than an actual physical place that you'll go. But the idea of a physical place, to me, that I will enter into a new body and be in the clouds with angels and all the people I've lost and all the people that were lost in the past, and I can rejoice and live and be absolutely happy and overjoyed and things like that. Um, that's something that can't be determined, because it's an idea. It's not something that we can empirically test. So it was invalid to me, and still kind of doesn't very really serve me in that sense as terms to mitigate my fear of my death. And even now, there's moments where just existing, I can almost, as if I can feel it physically. I don't know if anybody has this feeling, but I can almost feel as if like I'm being enveloped by, well, when I say enveloped by death, I guess you could say I'm enveloped by fear and this angst. And it's almost as if I have this idea in my head that drives me forward, this something that maybe rests in my unconscious mind, or something that rests in the back of my head, or something that I'm always aware of, that's a driving force to me to move forward and keep fighting. but there's moments to where it becomes so unbearable that it kind of almost consumes me for a couple seconds, to where I feel like I'm being completely crushed into dust. Um, I don't know if that's something most people feel or most normal people feel. I have no idea. But regardless of the fact, it's something that I feel and experience is real. Well, real to me anyway, whatever that means in this sense. But I've been a little bit of a tangent there. But regardless, my fear of death, I could not attribute any positive thing to dying. I didn't want to die, and I still don't want to die. And it's still a learning process for me now, but I ended up discovering the myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, who, well, it's a very long, complicated discussion. And maybe I might even dedicate a whole podcast to it because it was quite an abstract, complicated, and beautiful revelation in a sense that I felt once I read the book and kind of conceptualized the ideas with how the ideas he brought forth with my ideas about kind of looking at your struggle and turmoil and the nihilistic perspective of that, how nothing has any ultimate intrinsic meaning to it. Nothing is born with meaning. It's we bring forth the meaning onto things. We create our own meaning. But then having the world not care about us and having our existences kind of being boiled down to a fraction of a millisecond in the cosmic calendar of the universe, and that you'll be gone and people will forget you, and at some point the sun will die and every planet will be destroyed and humanity will be gone and we'll all die and unravel into nothing. It's very scary. It's a very scary thought. And it's something that strikes most human beings to the core. And I think it's one of the reasons why the origin of many religions were created, and philosophy, and a lot of psychology, and why people end up becoming so damaged psychologically is most of the time because things correlate to death. People have a fear of death. It's quite natural to fear death. And I mean, it's almost built into you as an animal itself. You avoid it. Your nervous system is to avoid pain, and to avoid pain is to avoid damage, and damage is to avoid harm to you. And why are you afraid of being harmed? Well, you don't want to be harmed. It hurts, yes, but we have these systems built into us and to protect our lives, to not die. It's built into you strongly. It's the essence of you, and you desire to procreate and pass off your genes into the future. So whatever consciousness is, you could somehow try and send that biologically into the future, and that is what brings forth maybe some kind of ultimate meaning in your life. But regardless, I mean, your kids will die and their kids will die, and I mean, there's so many factors of life that you don't know about, to where you and whatever you are will die. Your The essence of your life will die, and I mean, you're made of something that's considered not alive. That's what we consider, that's what most people consider abiogenesis. The creation of life is, most people see abiogenesis as the moment when non-life became life, and we don't really understand how that came to be, but there seems to be quite a distinction between life and non-life, at least what we can from it, at least from what we can examine. So it's complicated, and that's putting it short, not giving the devil his due, you know. But anyways, I found the myth of Sisyphus, and it's almost like I mentioned before, how gurus and religion brings forth some kind of meaning or helps you mitigate your fear of death. And in essence, Albert Camus is almost something that people who achieve achieve a place that I got to, or maybe people who are agnostic or atheistic. This is almost, in an essence, one of the methods to where you could kind of start to look at your death as not something that is something that binds you down, but maybe as your struggle and your turmoil, becoming content with your turmoil. It's a process that's very, very hard to manage. like I said before, with how it's the natural process of the limitation between things that bring them forth, you can some with that thought in my mind, I almost kind of gained a little bit of respect for the negativity and negative things in my life. Not as something that I hated, but maybe something that was unfortunate. Maybe more accurately describe it as something unfortunate and something that was just a product of life itself. And it made me a little bit less, negative towards the world and a little bit more respectful of just the world as a whole. Um, so I found the myth of Sisyphus being cursed to an eternal fate to pushing a rock up a mountain. And once you reach the peak, the rock will fall down again and you must push it back up for eternity. And that is the essence of your existence. And that is the most rawest form about how life can sometimes feel to people. Pushing a rock, your burden, the struggle, your pain up the hill, only for it to fall down. You're fighting something that's futile. Futile. I can't even speak. Futile. There's nothing you can do to stop it. And it's there. Your time is set. There's nothing you can do. So Sisyphus had to embrace the moment. He had to embrace the struggle. It's almost as if gratitude for having life at all. Gratitude turns out to be the key. And I'm not very. I definitely can feel right now. I'm not describing the ideas well enough, but regardless of the fact, I tried to express them the best I could. But anyways, found Sisyphus. I gained a little bit better of an appreciation for life, and my nihilistic views were a little bit mitigated because you can kind of gain a little bit of an appreciation for the limitations between things and the struggle and almost embracing the struggle because that's all you can do. You have no option but to embrace the struggle. I'm not necessarily sure how I want to conceptualize my fear and try to rid myself of my fear of death. I'm still not at that point yet, but I'm gaining a little bit more knowledge of it and I'm trying to discover more ideas, more thoughts, more intelligent people, um, and kind of trying to just live life and trying to go through the process of just feeling it out. And I think that's all of us what a lot of us should do. We shouldn't jump to conclusions. We should just feel it out and embrace the moment. Try to embrace that moment. Use it as your tool. It's a, it's a helpful tool to hold on. If you're ever at your lowest moment in your life and you feel like nothing can get worse, most of the time it can. Most of the time it can, and you think nothing can get better. Well, you have to embrace you have to embrace life. You have to embrace it. You have to figure it out. You have to read. You got to educate yourself. You got to do things that are difficult because I'm currently in the state of existence right now to where I purposely do difficult things. Like I try to exercise, I try to challenge my mind, I try to read, I try to do difficult things, I try to just do things that challenge me, and I feel pain and I struggle and I as if Sisyphus is pushing up the rock, I feel the pain. And the moment of levity where I'm at the top of the rock is more than enough for me to be satisfied. And even in the essence of pushing up the rock, I know that in the process of pushing and struggling and failing and in pain, I can feel alive. It's good to try and mitigate the things that are expedient in your life and things that are easy to that come easy to you because they're not very gratifying. Um, but regardless, I think I'll leave it at that. I think I'm going to try and get a little bit more into the idea of the books I've been reading recently and maybe a little bit more into the ideas of infinity because I was kind of getting into I wanted to get into the aspects of infinity, but I ended up not getting the chance to get into it. So, anyways, I digress. Thanks, guys, for listening to Big Small Cast. It's your boy Eden. Thanks for listening. If anybody wants to comment, if anybody even views this, I have no idea. Feel free to comment or critique. I'd love to know and I'd love to improve. That's kind of what my driving force is. Anyways, guys, peace out.